I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Majority
Madam
Leader is
President, I
recognized.
ask unanimous consent the quorum call be lifted,
Without objection.
and I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 23.
Questions on the motion? Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Markowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Capito, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Daines, Justice, Langford, Mullen, Hall, Sheehy, Thune, Tuberville. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Blunt Rochester, Cantwell, Durbin, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Kelly, Kim, Lujan, Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Banks, aye. Miss Ernst, aye. Mr. Budd, aye. Miss Lummis, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Tillis, aye.
Nobody wants to do it.
Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Slotkin, no.
Somebody has to have a skill. Special skill.
Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Sanders, no.
The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Justice, Kash Patel of Nevada to be Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Clerk will report.
The undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Kash Patel of Nevada to be Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, I ask the Senate execute the order of February 13th in relation to the Lutnick nomination.
The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Howard Lutnick of New York to be Secretary.
The questions on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, thank you, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, I got you. No, I'm. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell.
I do think it would be a mistake, though, for us to take the tax cuts. If we had a massive tax increase, it would hurt GDP.
Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy.
I'm up. Mary Ann, you got me?
I do, thank you. I think you just gotta stop. I got you. Thank
So,
you. Thank you.
nobody can object on it.
Thank you.
That I suggested that the tax cuts were speaking.
I got it.
Have a stimulus bill.
Thank you. I did.
That, the tax foundation is
Thank
most
you.
aligned with where our leadership is, and all the way over here. And the folks over here say it hurts us because it crowds out.
Thank you.
That crowds out private borrowing. And folks
Ms.
over
Collins.
here, bang for the buck.
Mr. Coons.
Corporate tax rates permanent.
Mr. Cornyn.
And so that's really
Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis.
people like tax funders.
Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth.
The debt to
Mr. Durbin.
that we're entering into
Ms. Ernst.
charter territory
Mr. Fetterman.
has the potential
Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego.
within 20 to 30
Mrs. Gillibrand.
to take our economy.
Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley.
So now,
Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. I got you. Mr. Hawley.
on the basis, operating income is going to get a 2.9% improvement,
Mr. Heinrich.
and everybody from 0 to 60%
Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono.
quintiles is going to get at best a 1%, sometimes less than 1% increase. But as you know, that's not telling the whole story.
Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
So there is the
Mr. Johnson.
child tax credit, which
Mr. Justice.
fundamental portion of it is not actually a tax cut, it's just welfare. But and that obviously
Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly.
So whereas the
Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim.
at least the second to the top,
Mr. King.
the child tax credit. And so
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee.
skewed to upper income. Now, I guess to go back to that's
Thanks.
because the taxes are skewed.
Mr. Lujan.
You're giving them people paying taxes, given that half of Americans don't pay.
Ms. Lummis.
Definition, someone who's at zero, you can't pay. They don't pay income tax.
Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall.
Or many, not everybody, but many. Yeah, they're paying payroll taxes, they're paying workers,
Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick.
workers, but excise taxes, etc. Gasoline.
Mr. Merkley.
So,
Mrs. Moody.
but if you look, for example,
Mr. Moran.
to 40% quintile,
Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski.
obviously
Mr. Murphy.
paying payroll tax.
Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff.
You know what I keep on thinking though? For the politics,
Mr. Padilla.
I went back and looked at the politics.
Mr. Paul.
We got slaughtered after the 2017
Mr. Peters.
in the midterm. We thought we were going to get a super
Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts.
majority in the Senate,
Mr. Risch.
and we gained one seat. They had
Ms.
two,
Rosen. Mr. Rounds.
and we got one seat. And then we lost the House.
Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz.
And that's because people did not see
Mr. Schiff.
from the TCJA in their life.
Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer.
We're not even giving them a tax cut, we're just maintaining it. To the degree that we're not cutting it to be a 1%.
Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina.
And it keeps coming to my mind,
Mrs. Shaheen.
and you said it so well, and I'll never get it.
Mr. Sheehy.
Box Canyon, da 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 da. We're going to drive into this box.
Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan.
And
Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis.
on and on. And
Mr.
the
Tuberville.
world gets slaughtered again politically.
Mr. Van Hollen.
I don't see preserving a 1%, keeping people from 1% tax cut
Mr. Warner.
when distributionally people
didn't, thank you.
are going to get a 3% tax cut.
Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Collins, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moody, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Ricketts, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, Wicker, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Bennett, Blunt Rochester, Cortez Masto, Durbin, Hickenlooper, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Murray, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schiff, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. No. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Kim, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Oh, hate. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. I have you. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Capito, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 45, and the nomination is confirmed. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that with respect to the Lutnick nomination, the motion to reconsider be considered made, laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to calendar number 13, S-Con Res 7.
The question occurs on the motion to proceed. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
You should, though. That actually be a good.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Thank you. She did. Thank you. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. I got you, Capito.
Josh Holly's at the door.
Yeah, okay. I got you.
I like your jacket.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Yeah.
We're getting you a copy of it to take up since you're
Okay. You're welcome, of course, Mr. Durbin. Yeah, I get him. I know. I got you, Senator. I did.
Thanks,
Thank you. I saw you. Thank you. I did. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay. Thank you. I did get you. Thank you. Senator Paul. I got you. I got you. No?
got me, no.
Okay. Shaheen, I got you. Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you. I did. Thank you. I'll get you. Thank you. Thank you. Sir, thank you. I do. Thank you. I did get her. Hold on a second. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Service is waiting back there.
I know, but everybody has to wait.
No, not yet.
Oh, earrings and the necklace. I didn't see that before.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fabulous.
Thank you. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. Ernst. No. Thank you, sir. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. It's the third one, yeah. Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice. Perfect timing. Thank you. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy. Thank you. I got you. Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Thank you. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, thank you, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lankford, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moreno, Mullen, Risch, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mrs. Moody, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Paul, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Lee, aye. Thank you. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Ms. Hassan, no.
Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Ms. Markowski. Ms. Markowski, aye.
The yeas are 50, the nays are 47, and the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the concurrent resolution.
Calendar number 13, S-Con Res 7, concurrent resolution setting forth the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2025, and so forth.
Mr. President.
The senator from Kentucky, from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with me today is my colleague from my office, Mr. John Lowry, and I appreciate his help. Last week, Mr. President, I spoke a few minutes about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. We call it CPB, and the Public Broadcasting Service, most people know of that as PBS, and the National Public Radio, which most people know is NPR. And I'm not going to repeat everything I said last week, but I do want to revise and extend my remarks. The United States Congress created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting back in the 60s, 1967, I think. Those were very different times. There was no internet. There was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. There was no cable TV. There were no podcasts. There were basically a handful, maybe a few more, of radio stations throughout America. And television was still pretty new. There were 3 main television stations with local affiliates. And many Americans, particularly in rural areas, didn't have access to radio and television for their news, because that's all there was. I remember those days. And so Congress decided to start providing money for what it called at that time public broadcasting, to make sure that everybody had access to news through radio and television, even if they didn't live in their big city. And Congress intended that news be news, factually based. Now, those were the days in America of true journalism. I remember them. Perhaps you do too, Mr. President. Those were not the days that we experience today, opinion journalism, where young journalists are taught to report on who, what, when, where, how, and their opinion. Those were days when the news was really the news, and it was fair and balanced. So the United States Congress created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPS. CPS here 50 years later, 50 plus years later, or CPB rather, still exists. And here's its relationship, CPB's relationship to NPR and PBS. We give CPB, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, about $500 million a year. A lot of money. And Corporation for Public Broadcasting turns around and picks certain local television and radio stations and gives most of that money to them. And then those local television and radio stations, the chosen few that get money from the American taxpayer through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, buy programming and content from two other organizations. If they're a radio station, they buy it from NPR. And if they're a television station, they buy that content from PBS. So up here you've got Corporation for Public Broadcasting. American taxpayer through Congress gives them $500 million a year. That money flows down to certain select local television and radio stations. And those local television and radio stations then buy content from NPR, if they're a radio station, or PBS, if they're a TV station, which were loosely affiliated with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Since this scheme was established, the American taxpayer has given all of these entities about, $14.5 billion. $14.5 billion. That would be enough to build 2,700 miles of paved roads throughout America. And I base that on the roads I'm talking about are not gravel roads, they're regular paved roads, 10 feet each lane, actually 12 feet each lane with a 3-foot shoulder on each side. But instead of building 2,700 miles of roads in our rural areas and in our urban areas that need infrastructure, we've decided to give this money to CPB, which gives it to the local stations, which gives it to PBS and NPR. I mentioned the local stations. Only a select few local stations get this taxpayer money. In my state, we have over 500 radio stations. Corporation for Public Broadcasting, in its unfettered discretion, only picks 7 to give the money to. The other 493 get nothing. We have over 150 TV stations in Louisiana. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting only gives the taxpayer money to 3 of them. So 147 get nothing. Now, I probably wouldn't object to this if the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and NPR and National Public Radio is what I'm referring to, of course, and PBS had been consistent with its original mission, which is to report factually the news to the American people. Government doesn't need to subsidize the media anymore because the world's changed. 97% of the people in America have the internet. But I still probably wouldn't object that much if the reporting by these entities was fair and was balanced, but it is not. No fair-minded person in America can look at this programming and believe that it's unbiased. It is decidedly prejudiced in favor of one point of view. That's not just my opinion. I think most Americans would agree with that. And because most Americans see the headlines that are produced by these 3 entities. I talked about some last week. This is what Americans' taxpayer money is going to do, to provide. Here's just some headlines from NPR. I mentioned these last week. I won't belabor them. Michael Avenatti, a profile of the media savvy attorney. NPR, this is from NPR. They loved Michael Avenatti, who, of course, is in jail today. He's a crook. But NPR loved him because he was anti-Republican and he was anti-President Trump. NPR published another article, How Racism Became a Marketing Tool for Country Music. Now, you don't have to be Euclid to see the implication here, that country music is racist, according to NPR. I don't think any fair-minded person would call that factual or fair and balanced. Here's another headline from NPR. Donald Trump's long embrace of Vladimir Putin. I also talked last week about a few other headlines from NPR. Here's one. Monuments and teams have changed names as America reckons with racism. Birds are next. That's what your tax dollars paid for. Eating less beef is a climate solution. Here's why that's hard for some American men. How the Taliban adds to Afghanistan's woes when it comes to climate-fueled disasters. No fair-minded person with an IQ above a single-cell organism would conclude that this is anything but biased to certain points of view. And there's more. I could do this all night, but I'm not. Here's some more headlines from NPR. There is no neutral. Nice white people can still be complicit in a racist society. That's what your tax dollars paid for. Another one. Ibram X. Kendi says no one is not racist. So what should we do? Another one. How artificial intelligence could perpetuate racism, sexism, and other biases in society. Another. Scientists debunk lab accident theory of pandemic emergence. Here's another one. As Trump pushes theory of virus origins, some see parallels to lead up to Iraq war. Your tax dollars at work. As U.S. confronts Russia, Trump's admiration of Putin is consistent. Another headline from NPR. The history of policing and race in the United States are deeply intertwined. Another. After Biden's debate performance, the presidential race is unchanged. This was the debate performance that President Biden gave, after which he got out of the race. If you believe that headline, you believe in the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny and that Jimmy Hoffa died of natural causes. But that's what NPR reported with your tax dollars. Here's more. Democracy on Trial, Part 1. A blueprint for the case against Trump. Is that fair and balanced? It's from PBS. Racism in the era of Trump, an oral history, another headline. January 13th, 2020. Another. This one's really special. A serial liar. How Sarah Palin ushered in the post-truth political era in which Trump has thrived. Now, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and NPR and PBS have the right, whether I like it or not, or whether you like it or not, or whether Americans like it or not, to publish these articles and to broadcast this news. That's the First Amendment. But they don't have the right to do it with taxpayer money. At least half of America would look at these headlines and be offended. They would be offended first because they would, really for three reasons. Number one, they disagree with opinion journalism. Number two, they would disagree with the headline. And number three, they would disagree with the fact that these headlines are not fair. They're not objective. They're obviously slanted to one point of view. And they're using taxpayer money. If someone introduced a bill tomorrow, I'll just pick a publication to prohibit the New York Times, I would vote against that bill and argue against it. If someone introduced a bill to get rid of Fox News, I'd have the same position. If someone introduced a bill to get rid of the Washington Post, that would be my position as well. Whether I agree with those media outlets or not, we have a First Amendment, and we cherish it. And I'm rather fond of the Constitution. But if someone introduced a bill to give money to CNN, taxpayer money to CNN, or to the New York Times, or Fox News, I would oppose that as well. This is simply wrong. And we're spending $500 million a year, $14.5 billion over time, to give to people at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and NPR and NPS to participate in opinion journalism, which they're entitled to do. But they can't do it on the taxpayer dime. They're doing it on the taxpayer dime, but they shouldn't be able to. I would also point out, Mr. President, that the folks at PBS and NPR and PBS are doing pretty well for themselves. NPR just bought a $201 million office space just up the road from the Capitol. $200 million. It came from the American taxpayer, so they could publish this stuff. NPR pays its hosts as much as $532,000 a year, taxpayer money. It pays its chief diversity officer about $320,000 a year. And you know what? Despite all of this money that the American taxpayer are giving to these left-of-center entities, their viewership has declined because people don't need them anymore. So why are we giving them money? I've introduced legislation to not to eliminate the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, not to eliminate the public broadcasting service, and not to eliminate the National Public Radio. They can go exist on their own if they want to, but I do want to defund them. We're running a $36 trillion in debt. This is disgraceful in 2025. It's disgraceful whether it is left-of-center opinion journalism or right-of-center opinion journalism. It is disgraceful for the American people to have to fund this rot. Doesn't mean the rot doesn't have a right to exist, but they don't have a right to taxpayer money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's late, so I'm going to not go to my second topic. I suggest the absence. Well, I take that back, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, I think I've got something to read.
Do you want to close here at the leader's desk?
No, I'll do it here.
That's Rule 22.
You want me to read the whole thing?
You have to read all these pages. Sorry.
Where's Stone? I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, at a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Democratic leader, but no later than Friday, February 28th, the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources be discharged from further consideration of SJ Res 10 and the Senate proceed to its consideration. Further, that there be 6 hours for debate only with the time equally divided between the leaders or their designees on the joint resolution. And that following the use or yielding back of that time, the joint resolution be read a third time and the Senate vote on the joint resolution with no further intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I have one request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. It has the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, or tomorrow, it stand adjourned until 10 o'clock a.m. on Wednesday, February 19th. That following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business then be closed, and the Senate resume consideration of Cal number 13, S-Con Res 7. Further, that at 12 o'clock noon, the Senate execute the order of February 13th in relation to the Loeffler nomination, and that following disposition of the Loeffler nomination, the Senate recess until 2:15 to allow for the weekly conference lectures. Finally, that all time during recess and adjournment count equally towards Cal number 13, S-Con Res 7, and that if any nominations are confirmed during Wednesday's session, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, is it Wednesday yet? Feels like it.
Of course.
I got over here to vote at 5 o'clock. Mr. President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Merkley,
Without objection.
to whom I apologize for him having to wait so long because of our inefficiencies.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Oregon.
This evening, we had a vote on the motion to proceed to the Republican budget resolution, and that passed. It's a simple majority vote. And this budget resolution has a very simple, straightforward theme. Families lose and billionaires win. The plan is simple. Slash programs for families, give massive tax giveaways to millionaires and billionaires, and run the country deeper into debt. That is not a plan that my constituents back home would vote for or support. They don't want to see the programs that enable families to stand on their feet be slashed or destroyed. They don't think that our mega millionaires and billionaires need more massive giveaways, and they certainly don't want to see the debt run up in the process. But that's where we are. Now, my Republican colleagues might say, well, not so fast. This bill is really about securing our border and national defense. But don't let that fool you. Senate Democrats are happy to entertain an appropriation bill to address these issues. In fact, we had a strong bipartisan defense spending bill in the Appropriations Committee last year. Senate Democrats also supported a bipartisan immigration bill, and that was just a year ago May. But the bill was killed. A bipartisan negotiated bill was killed when then candidate Trump said, Senate Republicans, I don't want you to fix the problem. I want to have this as a campaign element, the chaos at the border. So don't fix it. So it was killed. So you have Democrats ready to work on national defense as we have in the past and willing to work on security at the border. So this bill is not about that. This bill is about this: slashing programs for families, giving massive tax giveaways to the richest Americans. That's the real soul of the Republican budget resolution. Now, this resolution proposes over $9 trillion in cuts to programs. Just look at the budget table that accompanies the resolution. You'll see it in there. It basically has a line, unallocated cuts, $9 trillion. And that includes cutting $1 trillion out of the programs in the last 6 months of this year. One of our colleagues on the Republican side did an amendment that showed what those cuts of $1 trillion would do, let alone $9 trillion. And it would basically wipe out 5 major programs and cut another 5 major programs in half at the end of this year. So that vision of massive cuts to programs families depend on is right at the heart of this budget resolution. And this really is the great betrayal, because candidate Trump campaigned on the vision of helping families. But now that he's in office, he's reverting to the same plan he had in the last year of his first administration, which is slashing programs for families and giving massive tax cuts to mega millionaires and billionaires. We've seen this movie before. And the movie's director is a man named Russell Vought. He was head of OMB in the Trump administration the first time round. And who has Trump nominated to put in the place of the director of OMB, and now been confirmed by the Senate, but the same man, Russell Vought. And do we see the architecture of this plan anywhere else? Well, yes, we do. It's called Project 2025. That plan that President Trump said he didn't know anything about, but it was his director of OMB who was the architect of the plan, and it's that plan that's being implemented right now. And what is that plan? That plan is the great betrayal. Slash the programs for families, give tax giveaway to the richest Americans. Now, in the Budget Committee, we had a chance to examine this plan and propose amendments to it. We proposed 44 amendments, and all of them were voted down on a party line. So that was quite disappointing, because really what we were about was to say, hey, to our Republican colleagues, if you want to protect families, and this program isn't really about slashing programs for families, then vote with us to protect those programs. Well, so we put up amendment after amendment to protect those programs. One was about the cost of groceries. Democrats said, don't allow provisions into this bill that are going to drive up the cost of groceries. Democrats voted for protection. Republicans voted it down. Democrats said, don't put provisions into this bill that are going to cut Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security or in any other way make health care more expensive. Democrats voted for that protection. Republicans rejected it. Democrats put forward an amendment for provisions that would, against provisions that would raise the cost of rent or raise the cost of buying a home. Republicans on the committee rejected it. Democrats put forward an amendment to protect or hopefully lower the cost of drugs, and Republicans rejected it. Democrats put forward an amendment that said don't make changes in the law when this bill comes back that will increase the cost of going to college, and Republicans rejected it. Protecting the National School Lunch Program, Republicans rejected it. Protecting families against an increase in child care, Republicans rejected it. Protecting the investment in research for cancer, Alzheimer's, and other life-saving measures, medical measures, protect the funding for that, Republicans rejected it. Now, if this bill wasn't about slashing all those programs, why would Republicans vote against all those things? If they actually wanted to protect families, the programs that provide the foundation for families to be on their feet, to thrive, to move in the middle class, to prosper, why would they vote to open the door to slashing all those programs? And then we see that they're racing their House counterparts. At 10 a.m. last week, when we considered in committee the Republican Senate budget resolution, the House proceeded to put forward, and they're just down the hallway through this door over here, the House at the end of the hallway, they put forward their own budget resolution. Very, very similar, except in magnitude. And the House bill provides even more tax cuts for the richest Americans than does the Senate bill. So the stakes couldn't be higher. Where are we headed? Are we headed towards a bill this year that is going to make the rich richer, increase income inequality, proceed to help the wealthy run this country by and for the powerful, and undermine the vision of government by and for the people? That is exactly where the Republican budget resolution is headed. And if you kind of want to make sure that you really understand how true this is, think about the fact that the last budget presented by President Trump in his first term, his first 4 years, which was written by his current OMB director, Office of Management and Budget Director, Russell Vought, that had exactly the same architecture. It proposed slashing $1 trillion over a decade from programs for families. It slashed health care and housing for seniors and veterans, slashed funding for hospitals and community health centers, slashed school meal programs and food pantries, slashed Head Start and police and firefighting grants, slashed tax relief for families and veterans and retirement. $1 trillion in the last budget, but that was $1 trillion over 10 years. And what my Republicans are now proposing is $1 trillion over 1 year, just 1 year. And it's only actually half a year because there's only 6 months left in fiscal year 2025. When President Trump ran, when he was candidate Trump, he talked about reducing the costs for families. But everything he's doing now is sending costs upwards. It's Trumpflation. Trumpflation has arrived in the United States of America. Instead of slashing the price of groceries, he's proposing programs that will drive up the cost for hardworking families. That's Trumpflation. This budget resolution opens the door to making health care more expensive for families, not cheaper, more expensive. That's Trumpflation. This budget opens the door to making college more expensive by changing how college loans are administered. That's Trumpflation. This budget opens the door to unleashing carbon dioxide and methane pollution that drives climate chaos, that will drive up the cost of flood and fire insurance across America. In the West, it's fire insurance. In the Gulf and Florida, the southern states, it's flood insurance. That's Trumpflation. This budget opens the door to increasing the cost of child care, something working families really struggle with. It's Trumpflation. It opens the door to increasing the cost of prescription drugs. Trumpflation has arrived. Now, in each of these areas, we said don't do it. We said don't proceed to put into this budget resolution, opening these doors to these assaults on American families. Democrats said it in every way we could, and Republicans said nope. We want to cut those programs. We're not closing those doors. Now, I know American families don't agree with this vision. My office, the office of every senator here, every senator represented by their desks in this room, every office is receiving thousands of phone calls. I had a couple days last week, I got over 2,000 phone calls from Oregon. 2,000, that's an incredible number. And we had so many members of the team working, trying to answer every call live, but we couldn't keep up, even though my team has a highly coordinated ability to expand the number of people answering the phone. We couldn't keep up because people are so disturbed about this vision for America, this vision of attacking families and gold-plating billionaires. That's not an American vision, but it's the vision of President Trump. And then we have the second piece, the tax giveaways. The Senate budget resolution proposes $3.7 trillion in tax giveaways. To mega millionaires and billionaires get most of that. Just like in the first Trump tax cut proposal, tax giveaway proposal. It was something like 80% went to the top 10% in America. Well, I know that Elon Musk doesn't need more of our Treasury money. I know that the richest Americans, the mega billionaires, they don't need more of our Treasury and to run up our debt, but that's what this proposal does. The House budget resolution goes further, proposing $4.5 trillion in tax giveaways, and over in the weekend, there was article after article of Republicans saying that's not enough. We got all these tax giveaways we want to do to the powerful, and we can't fit them all into $4.5 trillion. We need more space. If you think I'm exaggerating, take a look at the budget put out by House Republicans last week. They included a mechanism to guarantee that they follow through on their tax cut programs to family. They linked the tax cuts directly to the program cuts for families. They said for every additional dollar they cut from safety net programs, they'll be able to give away an additional dollar to billionaires. They put that into their plan, that these two things are linked. Cuts to programs for families, the more you cut it, the more you can do tax giveaways to the wealthy. It doesn't stop there. All of this is going to result in higher deficits here in the United States. Now, my Republican colleagues are famous for campaigning on fiscal responsibility, but not delivering. This chart shows the difference between the first year of each Republican administration and the last year in terms of deficits. So if we're looking at H.W. Bush, he had more deficits in his last year than he did in his first. Clinton went the other direction. Clinton dropped the deficit year after year. In fact, in the end, produced surplus at the end of his 8 years. Well, along comes the second Bush presidency. He drives up the deficits from his first year to his last year over those 8 years. In comes Obama. Obama decreases them. In comes Trump in his first presidency, and he blows the lid off the whole thing, like bomb to the deficit and bomb to the debt. And then comes in Biden, and the deficits drop down again. This is the pattern. You've seen this movie before. It's often said, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, Americans, you've been fooled time and time again, and you're being fooled again, and it's all embedded in this budget resolution that is on the floor of the Senate right now. I find it just so remarkable that Democrats deliver on decreasing deficits, but somehow, through the magic of marketing, selling the sizzle instead of the steak, giving the talk instead of doing the walk, Republicans somehow still present themselves as fiscally conservative. Well, I encourage my colleagues to say, we're going to keep putting a spotlight on the fact that deficits are going to go up under President Trump, just as they have under every previous Republican president going back decades. I would like to think that we could come together as Democrats and Republicans and say, yeah, there's efficiencies to be found in programs, but it's also absurd to be giving away the treasury to the richest Americans. But if you want a symbol of where this administration is coming from, just take a look at the picture of President Trump doing his inaugural address, also just down this hallway in the rotunda. All you see is him backed up by one billionaire after another, 4 in a row, right behind him. They love this idea because, after all, there's never enough money for a billionaire. Well, I can tell you where I live, billionaires do not struggle. Where I live, families struggle. They struggle with health care. They struggle with housing. Housing, the vision of home ownership for your children. My father was a union mechanic. My mother, when we had children, stayed at home, worked in the home, did all kinds of activities with her kids. And on a single mechanic's income, you could easily buy a home. But not today. Not a single income. No, the price of homes is through the roof. The dream of home ownership is dying. And why? Because hedge funds are buying up single-family housing across America. And because we haven't invested enough in creating starter homes, in incentivizing the building of starter homes. You know, in the Budget Committee, we had a proposal that said, make it easier to put legislation forward that would discourage hedge funds from buying up single-family housing. They've been hard at it since 2009. When all those hundreds of thousands, millions of homes went into foreclosure because of bank deregulation, creating a massive national fiasco. Every Democrat said, yes, make it easier to take on the issue of home ownership. And every Republican said no. I don't like that this is a partisan outcome. I would love to see us partner to help out American families. Partner across the aisle for families. But we have an administration that is all about the rich and making them richer, and is all about slashing the programs families depend on. We have yet another threat to families, and that threat is the concentration of authoritarian power in the White House in a way we haven't seen in the entire history, almost 250 years of our republic. We have a president who has a thirst for authoritarian power, who admires Xi in China, admires Putin in Russia, sends his vice president over to Munich just days ago to badmouth the democracies of Europe that share our values of freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of assembly. Wow. But we not only have a president who admires authoritarian figures, admires dictators, he's acting like a dictator right here. He's breaking the law, and he's violating the Constitution. he proceeded to say, I'm going to cut all these programs that I don't like. Well, you know what? He doesn't have that power. We have what's called separation of powers in America. It means Congress sets the law, and then we have an executive, the president, who implements it. Now, President Nixon, you remember him, you remember Watergate, you remember the impeachment, remember the conviction, remember the resignation. Actually, never got to conviction because he resigned first. What did he do? He said, I'm going to be a bit imperial, and I'm going to not provide the funds that Congress told me had to be provided to various programs. And you know what? The courts said, hell no, you can't do that. It's called a republic. It's called separation of powers. It's called what it says in the Constitution, that Congress writes the law and the president executes it. Now, the president can request Congress to change a program that's already been authorized, already in the law. It's called a rescission. He sends a note over to Congress and says, you know, we don't need to spend as much money as you all appropriated for this program, or maybe that nuclear warhead we were going to refurbish has no longer got the right one for the right missile, so we can cancel that program. And he can send those over to us. But he doesn't get a line item veto. He doesn't get a line item reduction. In fact, in 1996, Republican Congress provided a line item veto power to the president, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't delegate that authority. If you violate that line between Congress making the law and the president executing it, you have destroyed the separation of powers, which is the heart of every democracy. It's that thin line of Congress making the laws that is the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship. And it's under assault. We're in the middle of a constitutional crisis. If you look at the speech that President Trump gave at the inauguration in the rotunda down the hall, he didn't talk about a vision in which he was going to work with Congress to get it implemented, to pass laws to make it happen. He talked about executive order after executive order, what he was going to do. That's the mind of an autocrat. That's a king, not a president. That is a threat to our Constitution. It's a threat to our republic. He's issued more than 60 executive orders, bypassing Congress entirely. And he went further. He handed the keys to the data systems across America to Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk was not elected. He was not confirmed by the Senate, has no independent oversight. Elon represents a concentration of power we have rarely seen. First, his power by being the CEO of large companies like SpaceX and Tesla and Starlink. Now, those companies have lots of lobbyists here on Capitol Hill, so that's a lot of power that Elon Musk has right there. And you know, here's something you might not know. He gets about $8 million a day in federal subsidies for his companies. I'd say that's a conflict of interest. Yeah. $8 million a day, that's roughly $2.5 billion over the course of a year. So here's a man, the richest man in the world, so he has that massive personal wealth, he has that power to run media campaigns or to hire lobbyists and hire lawyers. He's got his 3 companies, and they have that ability to do media campaigns and hire lobbyists and hire lawyers. So you have tremendous power there. But now he's been given the keys to agency after agency all across the United States government. What kind of a threat is that? Well, it's huge. It's huge because those databases contain the most private information on every American. The private health care records of people who are on Medicaid or Medicare, the financial records of every family that files a tax return. So his minions are now the foxes in the henhouse. So his corporate wealth, his personal wealth and power, and now his team controlling databases all across the government, including the payment systems as to what gets paid and what doesn't get paid. I don't want this man to have my Social Security information or yours, my tax information or yours, my address or my bank account numbers or my records or yours. And then he put the CFPB on the chopping block, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He posted a message that said, CFPB, rest in peace, RIP. Now, why does the richest man in the world want to get rid of an agency that has delivered $21 billion in checks back to consumers who were ripped off by illegal practices? I'd say that's something to say, hey, CFPB is a hero for working families. A hero for families, returning $21 billion to families who were ripped off by illegal practices. And because they shut down those illegal practices, they've probably saved consumers across this country, saved families across this country some other enormous sum. Maybe it's 5 times that $21 billion. I know that when I worked on payday loans in Oregon and we got rid of those 500%, 400%, 300% interest rates, millions, not millions, but tens of thousands of Oregonians who were victims of those 300, 400, 500% loan sharking benefited enormously. Well, who is a similar watchdog here for the nation? The CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But the rich hate it because they are the ones who have engaged in illegal practices to rip off consumers, and so they hate it that there's a watchdog. So here's Trump and Musk getting rid of the watchdogs, getting rid of the inspector generals and breaking the law while they do so. The law says you have to give 30 days notice to dismiss an inspector general, and you have to do it for cause, because we need watchdogs to make sure that the executive branch is playing by the rules. He fired them. He fired the FBI agents who are specialists in executive branch behavior, watching to make sure they follow the law. He fired them. And now the CFPB. What else? Well, I can tell you this. Musk and his minions, they could create a lot of damage with the access, and it's not just privacy, to your records and my records. It could also be by accidentally screwing up the computer code because they don't fully understand the details on what they're playing with. Let's be clear. Seniors living on fixed incomes cannot afford a single missed payment. They won't be able to buy their groceries or pay their rent, pay their mortgage. This chaos unleashed by Trump, unleashed by Musk, is illegal, unconstitutional, and just plain corrupt. Here's another piece of the puzzle that should disturb you all. In budget resolutions, deficits cannot be maintained for more than 10 years. Bad enough Republicans want to increase the deficit over the 10-year period, but they've come up with a plan where they change the baseline so that they can actually project those deficits beyond 10 years, basically indefinitely into the future. That's not fiscal responsibility. Not only are they planning to run up the debt for 10 years, but they want to be able to run it up forevermore until you get a Congress that has the spine to change it. Why does the party that has claimed fiscal responsibility want to change the baseline so they can run up debts far into the future? They've gotten off this game. They've sold this game, this scam, time after time. They sold it under Bush 1, they sold it under Bush 2, they sold it under Trump. They're going to do it again. They think they can get away with it again. So that's our job. Shine the spotlight on it and say no. American people, see what's happening and say no. Say you want programs of healthcare, housing, education, support for child care and for nutrition. You want to help families thrive so they can move into the middle class or move beyond the middle class. American families, speak up, because it is very true that in our republic, the one thing that can move this chamber is citizens back home telling us what they think about what's happening. Families lose, billionaires win. That's what's at stake in this budget resolution. The plan is simple: slash programs for families, give massive tax giveaways to mega millionaires and billionaires, run up the deficit in the process, and let Elon Musk and the minions dismantle the federal agencies that protect families from getting ripped off and exploited. This Republican budget, it is not government of, by, and for the people. This Republican budget is government of, by, and for the powerful. And Democrats will fight day and night against this diabolical plan to attack America's families. Thank you, Mr. President.
Stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.